Hello and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be focusing on many key and significant news stories that have occurred this week. Firstly, we'll be discussing the hideous terrorist attack that occurred in Boston at the Boston Marathon on Monday, and be asking who was behind this terrorist attack, and also what implications does this have for President Obama's counterterrorism policy. We'll also be remembering the fallen Israeli soldiers. That amounts to over 25,000 brave, courageous men and women who have actually died defending the State of Israel. And we'll also be celebrating Israel's 65th anniversary as she celebrates 65 years of independence since Israel was established on the 14th of May 1948. And I'm joined today by Robin Benson from Christian Friends of Israel. Robin, it's good to have you on the program tonight. I know that last night you were out partying at the Yom Ha'atzmaut celebrations at Wembley Arena. How was last night?
It was a really good evening, Simon. Probably somewhere in the region of 3,000 to 4,000 people in the arena. Lots of music, some comedy, some serious stuff too. We had Spellbound do one of their mesmerizing gymnastic displays, and Tracy Solomon was there, and some Israeli artists. So a good evening all told. But I have to confess that getting back to Eastbourne at 1:30 this morning has left me a little bit tired today. But anyway, here we are.
I'll go easy, so not too many demanding questions for you then, Robin.
Thanks.
Firstly, I'll say that Israel is the only nation in which a whole entire legitimacy is questioned on a constant basis, even though the State of Israel was actually formally formed through legal framework from the San Marino Conference in 1920, and then established by the United Nations in, I think, 1948. Yes. Why is Israel's legitimacy still questioned after 65 years of statehood?
It's actually a hard question to answer because it's irrational in many respects. I mean, if you look back at the history, post-World War I, yes. In fact, before World War I finished, you had the Balfour Declaration and all the back history that went with that. Leading in, yes, to this Allies conference at San Remo that then led into the Treaty of Sèvres and so on. So post-World War I treaties that established in international law the possibility of a Jewish state, that gave to the major Allied powers. They broke up the Middle East, the old Ottoman Empire, amongst themselves, and Britain was given the mandate. And Britain was actually, the UK was given the responsibility for setting up a Jewish homeland. Now, I was talking with a colleague from another ministry last night who came with us, and he has done a lot of research into the mandate period. And the more and more he delves into that, the more and more he has come to realize actually that Israel was set up despite the UK, not through us. I mean, we had a part in it, but actually, if you start to look into the archives and all the rest of it, there were lots of, use the word, machinations going on behind the scenes, actually to prevent the establishment of Jewish homeland. All of that then taken on board by the United Nations, formed as it was after the Second World War, with no caveats. The UN took full responsibility for everything that the League of Nations had established, and so, as a result, Israel declares its independence in 1948, and basically since then, off and on for the last 65 years, has had to battle for its literal survival. And we know the history: 65, 73, the Second Lebanon War, the various intifadas, the Gaza conflicts, and it just goes on and on and on. It's never ending. And on the human level, as I say, it does not make any rational sense. Why should one particular nation in the United Nations be the target of the vast majority of the other nations in the United Nations wanting to delegitimize its very existence in the world today? I mean, I think, without wanting to over-spiritualize it, from a Christian perspective, we have to say that behind the human scene, there is this age-old battle between good and evil going on, and what is happening in Israel is actually an outplaying of that battle, because there are key elements in biblical history and in what is yet to come in human history center around that little plot of ground that is no bigger than Wales or the state of New Jersey, as regards the Lord's return, and all that the Scripture teaches in relation to that. So in one sense, you could say actually the enemy of God is trying to prevent something that you and I as Christians know inevitably will come. But on the human level, it is just inexplicable. Historians, diplomats, politicians can give you all sorts of excuses, reasonings in today's society about the Middle East conflict. But in the end, when you actually start to apply some human logic to it, it does not make sense.
And before we go back to the issue of Israel, I just really want your impressions, Robin, of that hideous terrorist attack we saw at the Boston Marathon on Monday.
Well, it's just unbelievable. You watch the archive footage as has been replayed over and over now for the last couple of days, and you think to yourself, here is something that is a key event in North American sporting legend, because that's where the first marathon, citywide marathon, ever happened. So anything else, including the one that will happen in London in a few days' time, was actually spawned by the Boston Marathon. And here you have, again, I was watching the BBC News very early this morning because I couldn't get to sleep after getting back. I was just so wired after the music and all the rest of the razzmatazz from last night. One of the commentators put forward the idea that actually whoever perpetrated this event, it seemed that they had been observing either footage of previous marathons or had actually been there on previous occasions, because these two bombs went off at the very key moment in the time span of the Boston Marathon, where most of the participants are actually coming in, pretty much grouped or bundled together. And the vast majority of onlookers, supporters, family members are there to cheer them on over the finishing line. And you see the footage of the first bomb going off and people sort of looking around thinking, what on earth happened here? And not quite grasping the gravity of the situation. And then 10 seconds later, you see the puff of smoke from the second one further down the street, and it is just mass panic. But folk who realize that something is wrong from the first one are moving in the direction of the second. And of course, that's why there are so many more casualties, because some folk were actually moving into the space where the second explosion goes on. So it was well thought through, well timed. I mean, as you say, just a despicable act, whoever has perpetrated it. And I think it will take time for the American, the FBI and the rest of the investigating authorities, as again said last night. There's so much footage now, with mobile phones and all the rest of it. They have hours to filter through and try and discover, if they can, who planted these bombs.
And we've got a news clip to go to that looks at this hideous terrorist attack that occurred on Monday at the end of the Boston Marathon in the American city of Boston.
Two bombs exploded in packed streets near the finish line of the Boston Marathon on Monday, killing 3 people and injuring more than 130. A fire downtown near the central JFK Library was also reported. Security officials said another 2 explosive devices were found near the end of the marathon course. One of the dead was a child. The twin blasts at the race hit almost simultaneously and about 90 meters apart, tearing limbs off numerous people, knocking spectators and runners off their feet, shattering windows and sending smoke rising over the street. There were scenes of chaos as emergency rescue teams and some bystanders jumped in to assist injured, and thousands of others fled the site of the explosions. Police cordoned off the damaged area, and state police troopers in full combat armor took up defensive positions. Boston Police Commissioner Edward Davis asked people to stay indoors or go back to their hotel rooms and avoid crowds. He said authorities had received no specific intelligence that anything was going to happen at the race. The Federal Aviation Administration barred low-flying aircraft within 3.5 miles of the site. There were reports Boston's Logan Airport shut down its operations, but airport officials denied it. There was no word on the motive or who may have launched the attack. Police said no suspect was in custody. U.S. President Barack Obama went on television and said authorities will find out who did this, and we will hold them accountable. Those responsible will feel the full weight of justice. He said information was limited and called on Bostonians to help one another as the government puts together a manhunt and moves to help survivors.
We're now joined on the phone by the CBN's own terrorism correspondent, Eric Stickelbeck, has his own program called the Stickelbeck on Terror. Eric, it's great to have you on the Middle East Report. Can you share with us what the sense of feeling is in the United States at the moment in light of this hideous terrorist attack that occurred on Monday at the Boston Marathon in New York?
Well, Simon, it's great to be back with you, my friend. And, you know, a few things. I think among the American public, there's shock, there's horror, there's outrage. A terror attack on U.S. soil, an 8-year-old boy, one of the 3 people killed, on a really joyous day, Patriots Day in the city of Boston. The Boston Marathon, which is a great celebrated sporting event here. A lot of people are out cheering on their friends, their family members who are running in this marathon. So people are shocked, outraged, and look, we've had a number of just heinous events here on U.S. soil over the past few months alone. We had the Newtown shootings where 26 people were killed, including a lot of young first graders, young children. We had the Aurora, Colorado movie theater massacre back in July during a showing of the Batman movie. So there have been some horrible things happening on American soil. So the American public's shocked by that. But in the same vein, Simon, I almost sense a complacency. People are just going about their daily business, and it's almost like people are becoming numb in a way to all of these horrible events that are happening. I think that's a bad thing. Now, on the government level, the Obama administration, they don't have the answers yet about who was behind this. They're saying, hey, we're going to get who was behind this. Of course, they said the same thing about the Benghazi terror attacks in Libya, and we still don't have the perpetrators there. But in the mainstream media, the pro-Obama left-wing mainstream media here in the United States, Simon, I have to say, it's almost like they're openly rooting for whoever the monster was who did this, or monsters. They're openly rooting for it to be a white anti-government extremist in the Timothy McVeigh vein. They want it so bad to be someone like that rather than a Muslim terrorist. That's my impression. They have many reasons for that desire, but that's my impression so far.
And Eric, we know it's very, very early days yet to actually know who was actually behind this hideous terrorist attack on the Boston Marathon. But the fact that ball bearings were used in the improvised devices as well as nails indicates it could possibly be an Islamic terrorist attack, primarily because the Palestinian suicide bombers used the same tactics. What's your assessment on who could be behind this terrorist attack?
Simon, you make a great point. My gut has told me, again, we don't have all the details. We can't say definitively. We can't say for sure. My gut tells me, based on what we do know, that this was Islamic terror. I say that for a few reasons. Number one, what you mentioned. Inside these 2 bombs, there were ball bearings. There were nails designed to cause even more carnage after the bombs went off. We see this time and again in the Middle East, particularly used by Hamas in terror attacks against Israelis. So that's one thing. Number 2, multiple bombs. This is a hallmark of Al-Qaeda and Islamic terror groups. There were 2 bombs here in Boston that went off 10 seconds apart. Number 3, pressure cookers were used with these bombs. Al-Qaeda manuals. Al-Qaeda's official magazine, which, if you can believe it, Simon, is called Inspire, their official magazine recommended using pressure cookers to build homemade bombs. That's another thing used here. And the fourth and final thing, Simon, look, if this was an anti-government activist or extremist, you would think they would target a government facility, a federal building, the IRS building, some kind of government building, whereas this Boston attack was just indiscriminate madness, terrorism, violence. That's a hallmark of Islamic terror, that kind of indiscriminate killing where women, children, civilians are targeted. So adding all that together, my gut tells me it's Islamic terror, whether it's a localized Boston-based cell or someone from overseas who's directing it. We don't know. That's what my gut tells me. Hey, I may be wrong, but right now I'm leaning in that direction.
And also, it occurred on Patriots' Day in the United States, which is equivalent in England to a national bank holiday here in England. But it's also the home of the American Revolution. Do you believe this has significance and meaning to this terrorist attack?
It could. It could. You know, a lot of people brought that up, Simon. A lot of the people who were kind of pushing the narrative that, hey, this was probably a anti-government extremist, far right-wing guy like a Timothy McVeigh. A lot of people were pushing that narrative and saying, hey, it was tax day here in the States, April 15th, Patriots Day in Boston, and this could be some kind of extremist striking a blow against the government and trying to start a new American revolution. On the other hand, look, it could have significance as well for an Islamic terrorist who, you know, says, hey, this is the day that you celebrate the birth of America, one of the days along with the 4th of July, that you celebrate the birth of America. It's a great patriotic day. So it has significance for Islamic terrorists as well. And we know that Islamists are big on symbolism. They're big on attacking on days that have significance to a particular country. So you can go either way on that. The date may very well have some significance, but if it's Islamists, I think the main significance, Simon, would be, hey, it was a sporting event that would be heavily attended by a lot of civilians, the Boston Marathon. And we know that just last year, Al-Qaeda's top propagandist called on attacks against sporting events in the United States. Now, you would think Super Bowl, World Series, Stanley Cup, that kind of event. But the Boston Marathon, hey, it's a big deal, and there's thousands and thousands of people there, and a lot of civilians, women, children. As I said, one of the people who died in this attack was an 8-year-old boy who was cheering on his father who was running in the marathon. Another was a 29-year-old beautiful young woman. Simon, that is the epitome of terror. That kind of thing. It's just the epitome of psychological terror. That is the goal of terrorism, to terrorize people psychologically. And that attack in Boston absolutely accomplished that.
Eric, this is Rob, and I'm with Simon in the studio today. I work with Christian Friends of Israel here in the UK. Just maybe a question for clarification, because when the word started to come out in our media, there was the issue of that there were other unexploded devices. I mean, is that true, or was that just something that they picked up on and ran with, and then it sort of died into the background?
You know, it's interesting, because at first they said that there were 5 unexploded devices, and that was on Monday. Then later in the day, there were reports that emerged that said, no, that was a mistake. There were not 5 unexploded devices. Were there? Weren't there? We don't know. Would investigators kind of say, hey, let's kind of zip our lips about that, so to speak, because we're working on this investigation? I don't know. But I thought that was interesting that in the beginning, as you said, they said, look, not only were there the 2 bombs that went off, but there were 5 other devices that we found around Boston. And then a few hours later, the story kind of changed to, oh no, there were no other devices. That was interesting to me as well. I don't have any more details about that, but kind of strange.
Yeah. Which leads me on, Eric, to ask you, what has been the reaction of the Obama administration? Certainly, we know that President Obama has caused outrage at the fact that he didn't classify this initially as a terrorism act, but has later classified this as an act of terrorism. What do you think of the Obama's response to this hideous terrorist attack that occurred at the Boston Marathon on Monday?
You know, I think, number one, it was a disgrace that he didn't come out and call it terrorism right away. I mean, come on. It was pretty obvious that this was an act of terror off the bat. So why he didn't do that, I don't know. Does that go along with his narrative that basically the war on terror is over? Al-Qaeda is nearly defeated and on the run. That's what he was saying throughout the 2012 presidential campaign, which couldn't be further from the truth, as we saw in Benghazi and as we've seen in several other Islamic terror incidents since then. So this administration has always been very big on kind of downplaying Islamic terrorist attacks. Number one, because they want the American people to believe that, hey, the war on terror is over. The radical Islamic threat is nearly defeated. Osama bin Laden is dead. We can pack up our bags and go home. They want to focus on domestic issues, this administration, remaking America, as Obama himself has said, with Obamacare and everything else. And foreign policy, Iran, North Korea, Al-Qaeda, Benghazi, it's a distraction for Obama from his domestic agenda. So that's the first thing to remember here. And look, the other thing is, if this did have an Islamic terror angle, which I believe, I may be wrong, but I believe that right now, they will do everything they can to downplay the Islamic angle because, look, Islam is a religion of peace, and Muslims are an integral part of the fabric of American society. We saw this reaction in Fort Hood, where President Obama never mentioned the word Islam. He or anyone in his administration, they never even mentioned the word Islam in relation to the Fort Hood attack, even though the shooter at Fort Hood yelled Allahu Akbar as he was shooting his fellow soldiers. The Pentagon, our own Pentagon here in the U.S., in their summary of Fort Hood, they called Fort Hood, in which an Islamic terrorist who had been in touch with Al-Qaeda clerics overseas murdered 13 U.S. soldiers in cold blood while yelling Allahu Akbar. The Pentagon released a report calling it workplace violence. Not Islamic terror, workplace violence. Kind of like, two guys outside their company headquarters were haggling over a parking spot. Workplace violence. So that's where we're at with this administration.
Okay. And finally, Eric, the Israelis this week remember Yom HaZikaron, in which Israel remembers the fallen soldiers who have fought bravely to defend Israel and also been victims of terrorism. I think this is something that America and the Western world are beginning to wake up to the realization of what Israel has to face almost on a daily basis.
Yeah, and this is really what Israel has to face, Simon, in that this is the new blueprint. Look, Israel every day, and you know this so well, you've been there several times, Simon, so have I, Israelis every day have to deal with what we saw in Boston. I mean, every day. Buses, schools, shopping malls, indiscriminate killing, rockets coming out of Gaza. You never know where they're going to hit. Suicide bombers, rockets. This is every day in Israel, and that should give Americans even more of an appreciation of what Israel deals with. And really, this is the new blueprint, gentlemen, in my opinion, when it comes to Islamic terror. I'm not necessarily looking for the next 9/11. Of course, Islamic jihadists are working to accomplish that every day, and they want to acquire weapons of mass destruction, without a doubt, carry out maximum carnage. But in the meantime, these smaller scale attacks, like we saw in Boston, look, it's caused 3 people killed, 150 injured. Horrific. But it is relatively small scale. A few bombs, not on the scale of 9/11. A few bombs, pretty cheap, inexpensive. Probably just one or a few individuals carried it out. To me, that's the new blueprint. What we saw in Boston, what we saw in Times Square a few years ago, what we saw in London in 2005, mass transit. That is what I'm looking at. And in a free society, how do you defend against that without turning into a police state? Yeah. That's what we're wrestling with right now.
Eric, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today on the Middle East Report, and keep up the excellent work you're doing on CBN 700 Club and also with Steckelbeck on Terror, which is a great program which is aired on Revelation TV.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks so much for having me on, and God bless.
God bless. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
As we can see on that clip, there was original archive footage of what happened from a runner who was actually running in the Boston Marathon. It just shows you how terrifying that terrorist attack would have been had you actually been there. Robin, Israelis find themselves no stranger to terrorism, and many Israelis will certainly sympathize. They will certainly mourn with the victims of the Boston Marathon terrorist attack. But what can America and the Western world learn from the way that Israel deals with terrorism threats?
Well, you look at the way Israel has dealt with it over the years of its existence. It's just not tolerated it. or if it has seemed to tolerate it, it may just be for a period of time while intelligence is being gathered, and then action is taken to try and root it out at the very basic foundation. And sometimes, I mean, personally, I despair at our Western governments and diplomats and all the rest of it. We have seemed to become so politically correct and so afraid of offending the Muslim populations in our societies, many of whom just want to get on with life as they live it out in our society, that they are afraid to take the necessary action needed to nip this in the bud. I mean, we have multiple incidents of these extreme clerics being, continually let off the hook. I'm sure you and I can think of one in particular, who has made life for Home Secretaries here in the UK for the last few years, a living hell.
Abu Qatada.
Abu Qatada. I mean, that's a prime example. So there is the issue of trying to deal with it. Yes, I know you need to keep the Muslim population on side, and it's how you deal with it, but you don't let it slide, and that's what we're doing. And we are walking into a world of trouble, and it could be, we're speculating, it could be that what happened in Boston is just the opener for a new campaign in the West by those who really want to terrorize our societies. And this is just an opening salvo.
Looking at Israel's situation in prior to the second Intifada, where we were having suicide bombings going off almost on a weekly basis, causing huge carnage and damage throughout the whole of Israel.
Yes.
And thanks now to the security fence,
Yes.
terrorism, certainly the nature of suicide bombings, has
Yes.
completely fallen away.
Yeah.
And having been in Israel recently, there's not a sense of fear at all in the streets of Jerusalem or in Israel. I know Israel has to contend with rockets and missile attacks, but on the whole, I think Israel can be very proud in the fact that she's really defeated so much of those terrorism attacks.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, I think we have to be honest and say, but also there's something within the Jewish psyche that whatever is going on around you, you just get on with your lives. You can't completely blot out the possibility of an incident happening, but they have worked hard despite international pressure, despite all the criticism that has come with the security fence. And let's be clear again that something like only 5% of the total length of the fence is actually concrete wall. So when our media, the pro-Palestinian groups and all the rest of them constantly bombard us with these pictures of concrete blocks, that tall concrete blocks, that is 5% of the total length. And it is, if you look at the geography, they couldn't do it any other way because it's up, down, up and down and up and down over rough terrain. And it's the only way to prevent sniper shots from one community across to the other. And it's the only way to try and dissuade the bombings. And they have dropped. The statistics prove that it has worked. It's not ideal. Everybody recognizes that it's not ideal. I mean, you have Palestinians who will openly say they wish it wasn't there, but they recognize Israel's need to do it. So there's a minority even within the Palestinian community who recognize what's going on. So, but Israel took action to protect its people. And okay, we don't need to do that, but in our society, there are measures that we need to take in order to protect our society. That's what our government is there for, to protect everyone in it, not to pander to those who are always kicking up a fuss.
Robin, it's also very significant this week that Israel remembers Yom HaZikaron, which is the Memorial Day, in which Israel pays homage and tribute to the over 25,000 brave and courageous men and women who have died defending and fighting for the Jewish state. Isn't it important that Christians get behind Israel and constantly pray for the protection of the Israeli soldiers?
I agree. I mean, it probably opens up other questions, about praying for military and all the rest of it. But, let's put it this way. Jerusalem is the only city in the world that people who believe in God's word, the Bible, are commanded to pray for. Psalm 122, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And that's not just, peace in the sense of the absence of conflict. That word shalom means well-being, wholeness, prosperity. So, you're praying, and Jerusalem is the central focus of Jewish life. The Temple Mount, is the inner focus. But Jerusalem is a metaphor for the whole of the land of Israel. And so when you're praying for the peace of Jerusalem, you're actually asking for God to bring peace in every sense of the word, and in the very richest, deepest sense of the word, for all of Israeli society, not just for Jews, for Arabs, for Muslims, for Christians, for every member of the society that lives in the land of Israel. You're asking God to bring wholeness back into that situation. And we have to face the reality that God has ordained government for the good of the people. We were talking about this earlier on, and if folk want to, look up Romans chapter 13, the Apostle Paul is talking about the fact that God puts government in place, yes, to reward the good doer, but also to wield the sword against those who do evil. And you cannot do that without some sort of security services, security forces. So whatever our misgivings are about war, about conflict, nevertheless, these young men and women are putting their lives on the line for the good of all of Israeli society. Let's not just concentrate it down onto the Jewish people, but for the whole nation. Because in these bombing incidents and these terror incidents, there are Arabs and Christians and Jews being maimed. It's not just one side of the population, because it's an integrated population. It's not an apartheid state. Therefore, if there's a bus bombing, you'll have a mixed population on the bus. So it's all of society that we're praying into and beseeching God through these young men and women who give up 2 or 3 years of their lives and put their lives on the line every day in order to protect the nation.
Absolutely, and we've got a clip to go to now that looks at how Israel is marking the memorial service in Israel as Israel remembers those who have fallen defending the state of Israel during her 65 years of independence as a Jewish state.
It's Remembrance Day in Israel. The Jewish state is commemorating fallen soldiers and victims of terrorism. Over the past year, 92 names were added to the list of Israelis who fell while in the line of duty, bringing the total number to 23,085. Israelis are remembering not only the fallen, but also more than 5,000 widows of IDF soldiers and some 800 orphans that are no longer with a mother or father. It is traditional for Israelis to pay their respects on this somber day at a cemetery, and over 1.5 million citizens are expected to make a visit.
את הזר יניח כבוד נשיא בית המשפט העליון. ערב כ"ח בשבט תשנ"ז, 4 בפברואר.
אם ייגזר עלינו, נאחז בחרבנו ונצא לשדה המערכה אל מול מבקשי רעתנו.
גברת מגי לקריף, אלמנתו של איש
דגל, שק.
לרגע לא נשכח ותמיד נזכור את אלה אשר קיומה ותפארתה של ישראל נזקפת.
משמר דום, המשמר יעבור לנוח, עמוד נוח.
אלוהי המתים, שידעת ידוע כל זאת.
שנה אחרי אנו זקוקים לכולם, לטובים ביותר.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report, and it's also worth remembering that Israel has one of the most humane armies in the world, and certainly their treatment of their enemy, they treat them with the greatest respect and will often think and wait before actually going into a military or a violent confrontation. It's very, very important to remember that. This brings up a very important point, I think, Robin, that even some of our viewers have a wrong perspective on the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. And in many cases, if they carry out an operation against a terrorist entity, say against Hamas or part of the Fatah's terrorist faction like the Tanzim, they may actually go into the home of some ordinary Palestinians, but they pay them some money, they give them some bread, they pack everything up, and they put everything back in its place. If Israel wasn't in that constant fight against terrorism and being on a war footing, of course they wouldn't have to do this.
Yes.
But sadly, we see so much aggression and real hatred directed at the IDF, and that's why I think it's very, very important that we acknowledge the tremendous work they're doing in defending the Jewish state, and the fact that these are young people. They're in there of anything from about 17 to 19 with that great responsibility of defending the state of Israel and having friends that serve in the Israeli army. It's something that means a lot to me.
Yeah, I mean, the very name itself, the Israeli Defense Force. It's not an offensive army. It's there to defend the nation. It's there to defend all the people. And you, again, and I know from, multiple reports, whether they come from the UN, whether they come from guys like Colonel Kemp, who, have sometimes begrudgingly, sometimes very openly and upfront, in the case of Colonel Kemp, has stated categorically that Israel is one of the most, the defense forces are one of the most, what's the word? Humane, well, but legal. Their behavior is legal. I mean, I've listened to a presentation by an Israeli diplomat, and if you see the process that they have to go through in every instance where there's an encounter going on with an enemy force, the multiple people that are brought into the discussion about what they can do, what they cannot do under international law, it is it's mind-boggling that they ever accomplish anything, because they are so determined to be to have integrity in the way that they go about defending the nation, and that's proven over and over and over again. We know the cases where actually they want to do something, they suddenly discover that there are civilians either accidentally or, in the case of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, purposefully put in the way as a human shield, and they do not take that action forward. I mean, you can't. But any army makes mistakes, so we're not saying that they're as clean can be, but their mistakes are minimal in comparison to even, sadly, some of our own in some of the conflicts that we have been involved in.
Absolutely, and let's put we've got a clip to go to now that puts a human face to the IDF and tells a remarkable story of a young Israeli who made Aliyah to Israel, who died in 2006, and his name is Yohan Zabib, and he's a French Jew who made Aliyah from Israel, who served in the Israeli Defense Forces and was killed in action in 2006.
Je suis tout seul ici en Israël, ma famille est en France, et oui, je suis prêt. Je suis prêt à risquer ma vie pour défendre mon pays.
Yohan, c'était vraiment le moteur, la colle, entre guillemets, entre les membres de la famille. Et ce qui était vraiment très marqué chez lui, c'était cette joie de vivre. Lui qui avait un sourire très marqué, il avait cet amour très fort d'Israël. Il voulait à tout prix venir. Dans la vision de Yohan, c'est vraiment il faut donner de soi, et la meilleure façon de donner de soi en Israël, c'est de faire l'armée, en fin de compte.
את יוהאן הכרתי קודם כל בטירונות, בנובמבר 2004 זה היה. ישנו ביחד באוהל, היינו מיטה ליד מיטה, ותמיד היינו אחד ליד השני, וגם ברגעי משבר, ברגעים קשים, ברגעים הטובים. תמיד היינו ביחד.
הכרתי את יואן ולמעשה ליוויתי אותו מאותו רגע עד לרגע האחרון שלו.
Il a vraiment commencé à prendre les choses un peu plus au sérieux, dans le sens où il y a une réalité qui est retombée un petit peu en disant quand même, la vie c'est pas que s'amuser, en fin de compte il y a aussi des gens qui doivent faire des tâches qui sont pas très faciles.
במלחמה הוא הראה ממש אופי אחראי ורציני וציוני, צד שאני בחיים לא ראיתי ממנו.
יואן לא פחד, לפחות לא נתן את התחושה שהוא פוחד, הוא מאוד רציני, היה מאוד מפוקס, מאוד מבין את המטרה שלשמה אנחנו צריכים לעשות את זה, להגן על יישובי הצפון ולתת להם חיים של שקט.
צחקנו על כל הסיטואציה ועל זה שמישהו יכול למות, ולקחנו, זה נשמע מטומטם, אבל כאילו ככה לקחנו את זה, פשוט בינינו זה היה דיבור, לצחוק, ויואן דווקא תמיד אמר שלא, אל תפסיקו, אל תדברו ככה, זה לא טוב.
אנחנו, המשימה שלנו הייתה לתפוס בית ששלט על צומת נורא מרכזית בהמשך אותו ציר בתוך הכפר. נקלענו לקרב מול 5 מחבלים בתוך הבית והצלחנו להרוג את כל 5. גם יואן הרג את אחד המחבלים. אחרי שעשינו תדריך ואחרי שסיימנו את הכוחות בעצם גם אנחנו החלטנו לנוח אחרי שלא ישנו בזמן. 20 דקות אחרי שנרדמתי התעוררנו ברעש מטורף. מלא אבק, מלא אבנים, חול בתוך הפה, מלא שברים, אבנים, בעצם כל החדר נקרא לזה אדום. יואן תפס את הגב שלו, הוא עמד על הצד. עכשיו בגלל שאני מדבר צרפתית אז ישר הגעתי אליו, דיברתי איתו בצרפתית, אמרתי לו בצרפתית, שמע אל תדאג, אתה עדיין יפה. בעצם עד שהגיעו 2 המסוקים, העלינו את הפצועים שלנו על המסוקים, ביניהם את יואן. יואן עזב חי את לבנון. בדיעבד הוא נפטר בדרך לארץ, הוא הגיע לארץ כבר שאינו בין החיים.
Je suis sorti du Liban le matin et j'ai vu que j'avais 10 appels en absence, j'ai compris que quelque chose s'était passé, j'ai rappelé mes parents et ils m'ont dit.
אני בעצמי נפצעתי ואני זוכר שהלכתי לאחד החברים והוא אמר לי, שמעת על יואן? אז הוא סיפר לי שיואן נהרג.
לא סיפרתי לפלוגה במשך 3 ימים עד בעצם כניסת הפסקת האש. החיילים הגיבו בהלם כי יואן עזב חי. אני גם הגבתי בשוק שהבנתי שיואן נהרג כי הוא עזב חי, אז למה שהוא ימות? היה להם קשה מאוד לעכל את זה.
הוא חייך ואמר שתמסור להורים שלי שאני לא מתחרט ואני גאה במה שעשיתי, בבחירות שבחרתי.
ולפני שתעצום עיניים, שמור לי נשיקה אחת, לפני שניפרד לעולם. שמור את המילים האלה באוזניי, רק רעש וצלצול חזק.
C'était vraiment sans intérêt personnel. Il le faisait tout simplement parce qu'il voulait devenir israélien et c'était une vraie conviction sioniste.
Il voulait rien d'autre que donner de soi-même et être un membre de l'histoire sioniste d'Israël.
Aller au bout du rêve et puis mettre de côté tout ce qui est matériel pour aller à l'essentiel finalement et transcender son existence.
חבר.
אין לי ארץ אחרת, גם אם אדמתי בוערת, רק מילה בעברית חודרת, אלוקיי אל נשמתי, בגוף כואב, בלב רעב, כאן הוא ביתי. אין לי ארץ אחרת, גם אם אדמתי בוערת, רק מילה בעברית חודרת.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. In that clip there, we could see the personal cost that each Israeli family has to bear, knowing that they have to send their sons and daughters out on military service to defend the Jewish state. And sadly, over 25,000 Israelis have either been killed defending the state of Israel or acts of terrorism. So it's very, very important that we keep their memory alive and remember those who have fallen defending the Jewish state. Robin, it's also interesting to note, isn't it? It's not only Jewish people that serve in Israel's military, but also Muslim Bedouin Arabs and also members of the Arab Druze community who are some of Israel's top fighters, including Arab Christians who also serve in the IDF.
Yeah, we sometimes forget that, again, our society buys into this apartheid lie that, that's told repeatedly. There are, yes, folk from the Bedouin community, primarily up from the north of Israel, but also the Druze community. And there are Christian Arabs, yes, they're believers. There are believers from the Messianic Jewish community who are serving in the IDF. So it's not, again, it's a multicultural force in that sense. And there are those from those communities who have also given their lives in defense of the nation. And it's also, we need to recognize that there are folk in the Palestinian Arab community and the Muslim communities who are mourning the loss of family as well. The difficulty is that we forget the context, and that it is extremists from within that particular community that is keeping this conflict constantly going, encouraging people to become suicide bombers, martyrs for the cause, and bringing this shame and distress upon their families. So again, there's a need for balance in this, but to remember the context and where all of this conflict is coming from.
I just want to read out something. This was a very powerful speech made this week by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the memorial service held at Har Herzl, Mount Herzl. He said that since the birth of the State of Israel, many have tried to destroy it. They will never succeed. The IDF is stronger in every way. We will continue to strengthen our forces and act towards achieving peace with our neighbours and to protect our state. We'll always remember that we won't be here without our soldiers' willingness to fight for our existence. We salute the fallen, our loved ones, the heroes of the State of Israel. May they rest in peace, he said. And also Benjamin Netanyahu's own older brother, Jonathan Netanyahu, was killed during the Entebbe raid, in which Israel rescued so many of the hostages in Uganda in 1976. Isn't it important, though, that we reflect upon the huge costs and the huge sacrifice that ordinary Israeli families make defending the State of Israel?
Yes, it is, because, again, we tend to forget that Israel actually is comparatively a small society. And therefore, people like Benjamin Netanyahu's family have been touched by this conflict. And there's probably no family in any community, the length and the breadth of Israel, that doesn't either have a family member who's been touched in some way by this, whether they've actually been killed or they're injured in one of these terrorist attacks, or they know someone, because Israel is so community-oriented, so family-oriented, that have been touched in some way. So these things, these days of remembrance, whether it's for the Shoah, the Holocaust, or whether it's for fallen soldiers and terror victims, touch the whole nation, and it touches a chord in the whole nation. And then they move into this time of rejoicing for Independence Day, but it's rejoicing that's tinged with sadness and the remembrance of the price that has been paid so that Israel can maintain itself as a modern nation state in the world today.
Absolutely, and I think it's coming virtually to the end of the programme now, Robin, that Israel has 65 incredible years to celebrate. Israel's a modern, high-tech, industrialized nation. Israel's a beacon of light in which is becoming a very, very dark and dangerous region. And yet there's something that's so unique to the Jewish people, and that's their celebration of life. The fact that they can actually mourn the loss of soldiers, family members, but also then rejoice and celebrate the Jewish state and considering that's been reborn after 1948, 2,000 years or even 3,000 years prior to an independent Jewish state.
Yeah. No, it's wonderful. It's wonderful.
Which is wonderful. And we want to thank you so much for watching today's Middle East report as we remember the horrendous terrorist attack that occurred in Boston at the Boston Marathon on Monday. Our hearts go out to the families and the victims of that terrorism attack. But we also remember Yom HaZakaron, Israel's Remembrance Day, as Israel remembers the over 25,000 brave and courageous men and women who have died defending the state of Israel. And it's amazing to think that in Israel's 65 years, she's been involved in 5 major wars for her very survival. And yet Israel continues to be a beacon of light. And it's so important that we have an understanding, that we get to know the truth of what's happening about the situation that Israel faces in the Middle East, that we move from the lies and misinformation to find out the truth for ourselves. And we recognize the incredible role being carried out by the IDF in defending Israel today. And it's the soldiers who are Israel's defense. They come to the defense of Israel. So it's important that we pray and stand with Israel, but also remember the IDF soldiers in our thoughts and our prayers as they defend the state of Israel. And I thank you for watching today's Middle East report.
הולכים אחרי ארון, אחרי ארון. לאן הולכים כולם? הולכים לאט. חבר עוזב היום את העולם. השקט מסביב נראה שביר, לו לפחות היום היה סביר. מה עושים? מה אומרים?
כמו שראיתם, באנו פה, אתם יודעים, לחזק פה את הגזרה, הגענו עם שקים, מרחבים, הולכים לכבוש את לבנון, עוד היום או מחר או מחר.
צפופים בראש מורכן, בראש עמוד.